Not the kind of knock you ignore. Not the soft tap of a neighbor returning something borrowed. This was different, deliberate, heavy. The kind that changes the feeling of a room before you even reach the door. The kind that tells you, without a single word, that something has shifted. Nancy Guthrie opened it, and standing on her porch, in the stillness of what had been an ordinary morning in an ordinary American neighborhood, were federal agents, not local police, not county sheriffs, the FBI. They weren't there with news about someone else. They weren't following a complaint from down the street. They were there for her, specifically, purposefully, looking for answers to questions she may not have even known were being formed. Sit with that for a moment. You wake up the way you always do. Coffee brewing, light coming through the window at the same angle it always does. The morning feeling like every other morning. And then you open your front door, and everything you thought was solid just quietly stops being solid. People who knew Nancy described her in ways that made the scene even harder to picture. Soft-spoken, they said, faithful. A woman who had already walked through more grief than most people will ever be asked to carry, and who had turned that grief into something she freely gave to others. She wasn't someone you associated with federal investigations. She was someone you associated with quiet strength, with healing, with the kind of presence that makes suffering feel survivable. So when this story began to surface, when the pieces started coming together in ways that didn't fit the image people held of her, it didn't just unsettle the people who knew her personally. It reached further than that. It made people question what they thought they understood about grief itself, about faith, about the people we open ourselves to completely when we have nothing left to protect. What was the FBI looking for? And why her? Those two questions, simple as they sound, do not have simple answers. There are certain people who seem to arrive in our lives precisely when we need them most. They don't come announcing themselves. They don't come with credentials held up for inspection or speeches about what they can offer. They come quietly, usually after the worst has already happened, after the phone call, after the diagnosis, after the thing you always feared finally arrived. They sit beside you in the dark and somehow find language for what you couldn't name. You trust them without quite deciding to. It just happens, the way breathing happens. Nancy Guthrie was that person for a great many people. She didn't step into grief ministry from the outside, the way someone chooses a career path or a cause to champion. Grief came to her first. In 1998, Nancy and her husband David lost their infant daughter, Hope, 6 months after she was born. Hope had come into the world with Zellweger syndrome, a rare, severe genetic disorder with no treatment and no survival. From the beginning, the prognosis left no room for hope in the medical sense of the word. And yet Nancy and David walked that road openly, choosing to speak about their faith not from a polished distance, but from inside the wreckage of it. Raw, honest, present. When Hope died, something in Nancy could have gone permanently dark. That kind of loss, the loss of a child you held and watched and loved, and then had to let go, doesn't leave a person the way they were. It cannot. It reaches into places that ordinary pain never touches. For a while, Nancy pulled back. She wrote. She processed slowly, the way only slow things can actually be processed. She began speaking carefully about what it meant to trust something larger than her own understanding, while still feeling the full, undiminished weight of what she had lost. And then, in 2001, it happened again. Their second child, Gabriel, was born with the same syndrome, the same devastating prognosis, the same 6-month window, ticking quietly from the first breath. When Gabriel died, Nancy found herself somewhere that language barely reaches. A woman who had now buried 2 children, who had walked the same impossible road twice, and who still, somehow, chose to speak about faith rather than walk away from it entirely. That is what made people listen. Not polish, not performance, the sheer, undeniable weight of what she had lived through. She wrote books. She led retreats. She became, over time, a genuinely trusted voice in Christian grief communities, a guide for people navigating losses of their own, someone who understood from the inside what it meant to keep moving when everything in you wanted to stop, which is exactly why the morning the FBI came to her door is so difficult to fit into any version of her story that most people knew. The Nancy Guthrie that her readers and her audiences had come to rely on was built on authenticity, on credibility earned through real suffering, on a foundation that felt, to the people who trusted it, completely solid. So what changed? What had quietly shifted beneath the surface, far enough from public view that almost no one saw it coming? For years before any of this became public, Nancy Guthrie existed within a world that most people on the outside never fully see or think about. Grief ministry, particularly inside evangelical Christian communities, occupies a space that's genuinely hard to describe to someone who hasn't moved through it. It isn't clinical therapy, though the conversations are often just as raw. It isn't licensed counseling, though the intimacy of what's shared inside it can be extraordinary. It exists somewhere between witness and guidance. One person who has already been through the fire walking alongside another person who is currently burning, offering presence, scripture, a kind of structured hope. Nancy moved through that world with grace, with what appeared to be genuine purpose. Her books found readers who felt, often for the first time, that someone had put words to what they were carrying. Titles about waiting on God, about trusting His goodness inside inexplicable pain. They landed not as theology lectures but as company. She was invited to speak at churches, at conferences, at retreats attended by people who had come specifically because they needed to hear from someone who actually knew what loss felt like. She and David also founded Grief Share, a structured support program that eventually spread to thousands of churches across the country. This wasn't a small operation run quietly in the margins. This was widely recognized, widely used, institutionally embedded in the broader landscape of Christian community care. Hundreds of thousands of people had passed through it in some form. Nancy was not a shadowy or mysterious figure. She was visible, documented, well-regarded. Within those communities, she was more than respected. She was loved. People who had attended her retreats described something that stayed with them long afterward. Not just information received, but something shifted. Pastors recommended her resources freely. Readers carried her words into hospital rooms and through the haze of early grief, and out the other side. She had built something real, something that genuinely mattered to people in genuine pain. That is the world that existed before. That is the version of Nancy Guthrie's life that was standing undisturbed on the morning that the federal agents arrived on her porch, and understanding it, really understanding what was there, what had been built, what so many people had invested their trust into, is the only way to feel the true weight of what happened next. The details didn't surface the way you might expect. There was no dramatic announcement, no press conference, no single moment where the full picture suddenly became clear. Instead, it arrived the way uncomfortable truths usually do, in fragments. A quiet rumor moving through a community. A forum thread that gathered more attention than expected. Careful questions whispered among people who had assumed they already knew everything worth knowing. According to various reports, the investigation that brought federal agents to Nancy Guthrie's door grew out of allegations connected to financial matters, specifically. Questions raised about whether funds associated with ministries she was involved with had been handled in ways consistent with their stated purposes. It is important to say carefully and clearly, no official conclusion had been publicly established. At the time these reports were circulating, no formal charges had been announced in a way that permitted definitive statements about wrongdoing. What existed, in documented form, were questions, an active federal interest, the unmistakable presence of an investigation. But even just that, even the investigation itself, without resolution, hit the communities that had trusted her like something physical. Because Nancy Guthrie was never just a speaker or an author to the people who followed her work. She was a symbol of something they needed to believe in. She represented the idea that genuine faith could hold you inside the most obliterating circumstances imaginable. That someone who had truly, visibly suffered could be trusted because their suffering had somehow refined them, purified their motives, made them safe. When federal attention lands on someone carrying that kind of symbolic weight, the disruption it causes doesn't stop with that one person. It spreads. It moves through the community like a fracture through glass, quietly at first, then suddenly visible everywhere. People who had attended her retreats, began asking themselves questions they didn't want to ask. Pastors who had freely recommended her resources went still. Readers who had underlined her sentences and carried her words through the hardest nights of their lives felt something loosen that they hadn't expected to loosen. What do you do when the person who helped you survive your darkest moment is now standing at the center of a storm? You don't understand. There's a particular kind of vulnerability that exists inside grief spaces, and it is unlike almost any other. People who rive in those spaces are not riving with their defenses intact. They're not riving with the careful skepticism that ordinary life teaches us to carry. They come depleted, disoriented, stripped of the protective instincts that usually keep us measured and cautious. They come because they have no other good option. And when someone, a teacher, a minister, a guide, presents themselves inside that space as trustworthy, the trust that forms is not the ordinary kind that builds slowly over time, that it is immediate. It is layered with desperation and relief. It is the kind of trust that forms when you have been hollowed out completely and someone offers you a reason to keep breathing. That context matters deeply when thinking about what the investigation meant, not just legally, but humanly. According to reporting that emerged in the periods surrounding the FBI's involvement, the financial questions at the center of the inquiry focused on whether funds tied to charitable or ministry work had been directed in ways that didn't align with their stated purposes. Serious allegations in any setting, but inside a grief ministry built entirely on the credibility of personal suffering, they carried a weight that went well beyond the financial dimension. People began talking openly about the possibility that something had gone wrong, not in the theology, not in the message that had genuinely helped so many people, but in the structures surrounding it, the administrative layer, the financial infrastructure, the parts of ministry work that never appear in books or from stages, and are therefore rarely scrutinized by the people who benefit most from the work. And the picture that emerged refused to be simple. There were people who came forward to defend Nancy, people who had worked alongside her closely, who spoke about her character with real conviction. There were others who simply went quiet, which in close-knit communities carries its own kind of meaning. The narrative pulled in multiple directions at once, which is uncomfortable, but which also happens to be the shape that truth often takes. It refused to be easy, and that refusal is part of what makes it worth thinking about carefully. At some point in a story like this, the facts alone stop being enough. You find yourself needing to ask not just what happened, but what it means, what it reveals about the places we go when we are most broken, and about the people we choose to trust when we can't afford to trust wrong. There is something deeply understandable, almost inevitable, about the position Nancy Guthrie came to occupy. She had suffered genuinely. There was no fabrication at the foundation of her public identity. The loss of hope, the loss of Gabriel, the years of grief she carried forward into everything she wrote and taught, that was real, witnessed, documented, written about with a rawness that cannot be performed convincingly over the span of years and books and face-to-face encounters with people in real pain. And yet, according to reports, alongside that genuine suffering and that genuine ministry, there appear to have been decisions made, financial decisions, institutional decisions, that raised serious questions. And holding those two things at the same time is something most people find genuinely difficult to do. We want suffering to clarify people. We want the person who has endured enough to become somehow incapable of the quieter, more corrosive kinds of harm. It is a deeply human instinct. It makes grief feel meaningful if the person who survives it emerges purified in some way, more trustworthy, more safe. But suffering doesn't always refine. Sometimes it hollows. Sometimes the particular pressures that accumulate around public grief, the ministry, the speaking, the fundraising, the sustained weight of other people's expectations, create conditions where small compromises become larger ones gradually, without any single clear moment of decision. That is not an excuse for anything, but it is a context worth sitting with honestly rather than discarding. The people who had been genuinely helped by Nancy's work, and there were many, found themselves somewhere deeply uncomfortable, because dismissing the good that happened to them would require dismissing something real inside themselves, their own healing, their own survival of seasons they weren't sure they'd make it through. That help was not imaginary, and it did not simply disappear because the person who offered it was now under scrutiny. How do you hold gratitude and suspicion at the same time without letting one cancel the other? That question didn't have a clean answer then, and for many people, it still doesn't. Federal investigations move slowly, and they rarely reveal themselves fully until they are finished. What surrounded Nancy Guthrie's situation continued developing in ways that resisted any attempt to resolve it into something manageable. According to various reports, the inquiry touched multiple threads simultaneously. Questions about organizational finances, about the relationships between different ministry structures, about how charitable work and personal benefit can blur together inside organizations small enough to run largely on personal trust rather than formal oversight. This is not an unusual landscape in faith-based nonprofit work. Many ministries operate with limited financial infrastructure, thin administrative oversight, and an implicit reliance on the integrity of the people at the center. That is not inherently problematic, but it does create conditions where things can go wrong quietly, without the natural friction that more structured accountability tends to provide. What made Nancy Guthrie's situation cut deeper than a typical financial investigation was the specific contrast it created. Here was a woman who had built her entire public identity around vulnerability, who had written beautifully and honestly about releasing control, about trusting beyond your own understanding, about the freedom that comes when you stop pretending you can manage everything. And the investigation, by its nature, raised the possibility that in certain areas, the ones that stayed out of view, control may have been exercised in ways that weren't transparent. That contrast between the message people had built their trust on and the behavior being examined was precisely what made the emotional response so layered and so difficult to name. It wasn't simple anger. It was something older and heavier than that. It was the grief of having to revise a story you had already woven into yourself. The grief of realizing that the person who once helped you name your own loss was now at the center of a different kind of loss, one of credibility, of trust, of the specific connection that, once broken, can't be repaired by explanation alone. Some people chose to wait, to extend grace, as they described it, to hold space for complexity rather than collapsing everything into a verdict. Others quietly removed her books from their shelves, quietly distanced themselves from programs they had once promoted without hesitation. And somewhere between all of those responses, Nancy Guthrie herself continued to exist, not as a symbol or a cautionary tale or a headline, but as a person, a woman who had genuinely buried two of her children, and who now faced a completely different kind of unraveling, in public, with no road map for how to survive it. There are stories that stay with you precisely because they never fully resolve. This is one of them. It doesn't offer the clean comfort of a clear villain or a clear victim. It doesn't end with a lesson you can extract neatly and carry with you into your next decision. What it offers instead is something less comfortable and more lasting. An honest look at the complicated territory that exists between the best and worst of what people are capable of. It asks you to think about who you trust when you are most desperate for trust, not because the people who occupy those positions are dangerous by nature. Most of them are not. Most of them are operating from real care, real experience, real desire to offer something meaningful to people in pain. But desperation lowers our defenses. Grief lowers them further. And inside those quieter, more open states, we can sometimes extend a degree of faith in another person that person was never fully equipped to carry without something eventually giving way. Nancy Guthrie carried something that almost no one is ever asked to carry. The death of one child is catastrophic. The death of two, from the same cause, within the same window of time, in the same home, that is a weight that permanently changes the architecture of a person. For years, she held that weight in public and turned it towards something that helped others hold their own. That cannot be erased. That happened. It was real for the people it reached, and it lives in them still. And yet the questions raised by the investigation also cannot be simply set aside. Questions about accountability, about the structures we build around grief work, about what happens when the person at the center of a community of trust is also human enough to make decisions that deserve examination. Those questions matter. They matter for the people who were hurt, if people were hurt. They matter for the communities trying to understand what they are supposed to feel. We want our guides to be made pure by what they've endured. We want suffering to be a credential that guarantees something. Sometimes it does, and sometimes the suffering just left a person quietly fractured in ways they couldn't fully see in themselves, let alone show to the people watching them.